Perfect.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second of our 3-monthly Ask the Conservator session. And my phone starts vibrating right on cue. We'll just let that finish. Today we have a special guest joining me and Barrett Keating, and that is Bexx Caswell-Olson, who's the head of book conservation at NEDCC, which is about 3 miles up the road from me. Bexx and I actually met not in a conservation context, but as vendors and attendees to mass historical conferences a couple years ago. And she's not only a wonderful conservator, but a very savvy professional who understands what is going on in the museums that we work for, more than a lot of the people that I've met. So she's here today to answer any questions you have about book and paper objects. And Barrett Keating, as you may know, is a furniture and wooden artifacts conservator, and I'm a textile conservator. So our goal today is to just meet you and have you ask us questions about artifacts that you are curious about, things that are under your custody, or basically maybe where to find information related to collections care and conservation topics. And if things get slow, each of us also brought a tool that we're going to try to stump you with. Dan Yeager's already stumped us prior with his gadget. And it just goes to show sort of how conservators and collections care people need to use a combination of specific trade tools, things from Home Depot, gadgets you make in the garage, et cetera, et cetera. And we steal a lot from other industries. And I think that's a unique metaphor that happens all across museums, as we know. So we are ready to take questions. I can't see anybody but the people I know here. So perhaps, Scarlett, you can help us.
Yeah, folks are welcome to either unmute themselves, type in the chat, or you can raise your hand as well as a reaction. So a pretty open, informal conversation.
Don't make us go to the gadgets this early.
You want me to salt the mines here? Because I got a question.
Salt the mines.
So here's what I'm curious about. With all the rains that we've had recently, it lends me to think about, sort of the damage that moisture, humidity, and outright, flooding perhaps, or minor flooding happens in our institutions. And, obviously paper bears a brunt of the immediate impact of those kinds of things. And I guess this would be a question for Bexx in particular, like what kinds of steps should we be taking as institutions if we've got, let's just say a lot of humidity or, sort of minor flooding. What do we do about some of our collections that are probably in basements and that kind of thing? What can we be doing versus what do we need to be thinking about shipping off to y'all at NEDCC to actually take care of? Are there like strategies that we can use immediately in the aftermath to stabilize things perhaps, or what are the steps that we as just say institutions, non-conservators should be doing with our collections in that regard?
Sure. So that's a great question and definitely very relevant with the weather that we've been having here in New England. Has been very, very wet. So one thing to think about sort of as some preventative maintenance is making sure that you're keeping up with regular building maintenance, making sure that you're doing like fall cleanup to clear leaves out of your gutters and your outdoor drains, keeping vegetation away from your building so that when it does rain heavily, the water has a place to go that's not into your basement, that it goes away from your building. That's number one. Number two would be to think about if you do have things that are stored in the basement, making sure that you're not storing those things like in boxes that are directly on the floor. So up on shelving, away from exterior walls, because those are the places that are if you're taking on water, those things are going to be the most likely to get wet. So if you can avoid that, that's great. But I know that space is a reality for people and that may not be possible. If things do get wet, you have about 24 to 48 hours before mold is a concern, before mold will really start to germinate and grow. So your goal then needs to get things as dry as soon as possible and as cold as possible too. So if you're able to freeze things, and you can freeze most books and paper, I would not freeze parchment or vellum. I would think twice about leather. Call me if you have leather. And photographs, I would not freeze or any sort of film material, but other books and paper you can freeze. Getting some good airflow in that room to help, mold really like stagnant air. So if you have air moving, that's going to inhibit mold growth. Those are all some things that you can do. And then on NADCC's website, we have 2 great leaflets in section 3 of the preservation leaflets, which is emergency management. There's one specific to emergency salvage of moldy books and paper, which I recently updated. And thank you, Scarlett, for putting that link in the chat. That will give you some guidance on how to proceed with dealing with a mold outbreak and cleaning mold, whether that's active mold that you need to dry first or inactive mold. And then we also have a great leaflet on freezing and drying books if those things do get wet. But definitely something I unfortunately am answering a lot of questions about at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to chip in and say that I have a website too, museumtextiles.com, and in our resources section, we have a couple of quick reference charts for dealing with still wet artifacts and no longer wet artifacts. They're just like little trees that tell you, like, if this, then this should be my immediate response, etc. And then at the bottom of all of them, of course, is contact a conservator or other collection professional. But they're sort of a good quick reference that you can, tape to a file cabinet or something. They're not as good as some of the national resources we've seen, like Salvage wheels and stuff that you might have picked up at conferences, but they're quickie things anyway. Anytime we talk about environment, I like to remind people of a very easy sort of beginning moniker that I learned from one of our conservation environment specialists, which is that if you have 90% relative humidity and 90 degrees or above, for 3 days, you can get a mold outbreak. Think after a hurricane, no power, or AC breaks, something like that. So if it is a heat wave like we had with those conditions, you should start thinking on day 1, if this is going to be three days long, I need to immediately jump in and think about air circulation and maybe moving our artifacts to drier areas, etc. If you have 80 degrees and a sustained 80% or higher relative humidity, like we do sort of in tropical places in our country, it can take only 3 weeks before the mold to flourish and become noticeable and start doing harm. So that's a condition that we also can frequently sort of a threshold we also reach a couple times in New England throughout the summer. But we receive the most calls in around August and September. After 3 months of 70 degrees and 70% relative humidity, that's also a threshold that brings on mold. And that is such a sort of sustainable, livable condition, a little muggy, but many of our rooms are like that all summer, and we don't even realize that after 3 months, you might start to see a mold issue as well. So those are just sort of quick to remember guidelines about how urgent you need to be thinking about this problem.
Oops, sorry, Bexx.
I wanted to follow up because Camille mentioned the salvage wheel, and I happen to have one right here. It's got a magnet on it, so it's right next to my desk. And I did see on AIC, the American Institute for Conservation, on their Facebook yesterday, they were mentioning the salvage wheel and that they had some to give away, and you could fill out a Google form to get one for free. So I just thought I would mention that. They also are available for purchase, but free is always nice. And then I see a question in the chat about freezing. How does that work to care for artifacts that are wet? Freezing basically buys you some time until you can have time and space to properly dry them out, whether that's something that you're doing yourself or you're having a contractor do for you. And it will kind of prevent mold from growing on anything that's wet. But basically freezing is going to buy you time. And then there are also vendors that can vacuum freeze dry things so they're frozen, and then they basically in a chamber remove all of the moisture, and that will help dry things.
I see Monica also asked a question around a trophy. Monica, I don't know if you wanted to unmute and speak to the question, but it looks like you all have an 1800s trophy that might have had some fire damage and was wondering about restoring the piece. Whoever might want to take that.
I'll respond. Monica, first would ask you what your conservation policy is for your institution. Do you have maybe a meeting every 3 months or something where you discuss things that you would like to propose for, to get a conservation report on? And if your question is, how do I know if this object needs urgent treatment? Then reaching out to an objects conservator that deals with metal is a nice first step. They might be able to tell you not only how they work, but a few hints about what you might observe and document that will help you make that decision. But in the end, it's a budgetary decision, but you want to inform yourself about whether anything that's going on right now is urgent and needs to be addressed urgently. In the exception of, say, pest, water, fire, things like that, a lot of your concerns about objects are not super urgent. So I say take the time to locate an objects conservator and ask them sort of the technical side while you're problem solving the logistics side within your institution. And then I'm going to give you information on where to find conservators, but also I would be remiss if I didn't say to you that anytime we do a conservation treatment, we might be involved in reversing the appearance of the artifact as we receive it. And in doing so, we are always reversing evidence of the lifespan of this artifact. So sometimes you might think that the appearance of something is the first thing we might recommend to remedy, but we would actually stabilize it and perhaps maintain the visual evidence that it's saying, because it enables you to tell a story that's unique to that artifact. So you might want to find out a little bit more about the trophy, why it has this damage, and see if that's part of its story before you consider reversing it. But to find a list of national conservators, you can go on to the American Institute for Conservation website, which is culturalheritage.org, and they have a Find an Expert, sometimes called Find a Conservator. They're in the process of transitioning to a more open term, Find an Expert. And there you can put in your location, the medium you're curious about, and they'll give you a list of conservators that you can contact. I think that's the best answer you're going to get from wood, book, and textile people. I had a question for Barrett.
Yes.
Barrett, when I worked at a historical society, we discovered one of those late summer mold outbreaks, and we found that the underneath and all the finished sides of our case furniture that had been out on display were all covered in a thin layer of mildew. And I wondered if you could tell us what you might recommend people do if they discover that that's happened to their furniture.
Yes, that's something we deal with, Camille, 24/7, all year long, unfortunately, because of climate change and just the temperatures and the humidity being so high for the last 20 years. We're just about every piece that comes in and out of the shop now has to have mold removal done before any other treatment. So on the underside with furniture, it's a lot easier because you can use denatured alcohol, which does a great job of killing the mold. But there are a few caveats. You have to make sure there's no chalk inscriptions or any ink inscriptions or things that might be lost if you go washing it away with denatured alcohol on a pad. Same thing with labels. Anything that's important to the history of the piece, you just dab very carefully with the alcohol. You don't want to go swiping it off. When it comes to the finish on the outside of the piece, it's a different thing. It has to have a cleaning with a pretty elaborate soap that has biocides in it, something that's not deleterious to the finish, and because you're also removing all the dirt layers that the mold grows on. So that's basically the rough in and outs of removing mold on furniture. The other caveat for the underside is you might have a dye there that was the dye that was used to dye all of the wood on the piece. And on the underside, the dye is exposed. You have just the wood and the dye on it, and there was never a film finish such as shellac put on top of it. So that is very susceptible to alcohol. So again, if you find a dye underneath, you want to test with a Q-tip first. You'd be patting alcohol on very gently so as to not pick up too much of that original dye. But yeah, every piece we work on, unfortunately, has mold now. And that's the number one thing we do when it comes into the shop, because mold is so deleterious to your health, especially long-term exposure, that if we didn't do this to every piece, we'd be surrounded by mold spores constantly. And then to back up what Bex said and you said, we just always try to have our institutions and all of our clients keep the relative humidity 65% or lower and the temperature 65% or lower as well. And that will prevent the propagation of mold or the further growth of mold.
Mhm. Is it true, Barrett, that more damage is done to wooden artifacts and furniture from low humidity than from, for example, in when we heat these historic spaces in winter, than from high humidity?
Yeah, I think to answer that question, it all depends on how a piece of furniture is made. If it's made by a very knowledgeable cabinet maker, they understand wood movement and they allow for the movement of wood during the normal seasons, from dry winters, especially here in New England, to very moist summers. In period times, that was done through using some very stable woods that you'll find in all your major museums. New England pine, mahogany is a very stable wood, walnut, and oaks, and these are your major wood groups that they do well, and their coefficient of expansion is acceptable to the range of the temperature and humidity in this region. But once you start using tropical woods like rosewood, most of that imported Chinese trade blackwood or rosewood furniture has disastrous results when it gets to New England. And to your point, it's usually the shrinkage that happens in the winter. All of the mitered joints just break apart and they just can't hold together because they're used to being from the Orient, where they're in an extremely humid environment. So yeah, especially pieces that are in houses and they're overheaters, whether it's forced hot air and they put the piece right over the hot air, yeah, that's going to dry it out so fast and furiously that you do come down to a lot of cracking in the carcass and the sides and the tops. And then the other worst thing that happens is if they get improperly restored, people try to fill those cracks with fillers and epoxies and things, not thinking that when the summer comes around and there's more humidity, those wooden pieces that have cracked in the winter when it's dry are going to want to expand. And so now when they try to expand in the summertime, they have no place to go because the expansion crack's been filled and they're just going to break something else further out in the piece. So yeah, there's a lot going on, but a well-made piece will allow for expansion and contraction. But on a daily basis, I'm taking apart nails and glue, the people that have glued parts that are supposed to be free, like floating panels, and backsplats that are supposed to float between a crest rail and a shoe on a chair. People nail them in, they glue them in because they just can't stand the idea of something being loose and expanding and contracting. So yeah, both ends of the spectrum can cause problems, but you may be right. The dry end may be a little bit worse, and what people do after that. Good question.
Bex, there are two questions in the chat room that I'd like to invite you to answer. The first one is from Karen Feeney. What should you do with a donation that is mixed materials, linen, paper, with some items affected by mold? We have a collection of maps from a local surveyor that range from the 10s to the 70s. In addition, we have another question, say, resources on how to store maps. That's also from Karen. Would you like to address that, Bex?
Certainly. So I did take a look at that link of pictures of those maps, and that mold does look kind of scary to me, but it does look like it's dry. So that's good. And so that means that you can vacuum that to remove that. And to do that safely, you would want to most certainly be wearing an N95 mask or a half-face respirator, so other protective clothing just to keep your clothes clean. Goggles that are not vented, that have a tight seal on your face just to keep it out of your eyes, and then use a HEPA vacuum. And if you have the ability to work in a fume hood, that's optimal. If you don't, then I would maybe work outside. And if you can't work outside because it's just constantly raining like it's been, at the very least near a window with a fan that's venting to outside. Because as you're vacuuming, you will be disturbing that mold, and you don't want to just end up putting it all over your space. You know, you want it to go outside. Away from you. So, and I'm just going to put a link in the chat to the preservation leaflet on salvage of moldy books and paper. And there are some directions for vacuuming and suggestions and some pictures. And I don't have the link handy, but I can get it shortly. NEDCC now has a YouTube channel. And so I made recently a quick little video demonstrating how to vacuum mold, and I'm suited up and all that, just to kind of help illustrate that for people. So I hope that helps. And then in terms of storing maps, I guess it depends. If they're flat and you can store them flat, that's the best in flat file cabinets, but I know those take up a huge amount of space and not everyone has space for those. If you can roll them, that's okay. Preferably roll it around a tube so that they don't get crushed. And if you can't afford the very expensive acid-free archival tubes, you can buy just regular tubes. The wider the diameter, the better. And wrap those in like Mylar or Tyvek or just something that's a barrier material so that you don't have the map directly on those acidic tubes. And, you know, if you can lay those tubes this way, not this way, because if they're this way, they kind of like if you ever store wrapping paper that way, it like slumps down and gets all smushed at the end. So if you can keep them this way, that's better. And I'm going to just look real quick. I know that we do have a leaflet that it specifically addresses handling oversized materials, including maps. And I think there are some nice illustrations there. And I'm just quickly trying to scan for storage solutions for oversized paper artifacts. Here we go. So I will put this in the chat as well. And that just has some nice suggestions. But yeah, storing oversized things is always a challenge. If they have, do these maps by any chance have like the wood stretcher bar on them?
No, they don't. They're just the map itself.
Good, because those wood bars can sometimes be problematic, and we sometimes suggest removing those if possible. But so I hope
you have some with that, but not in this particular collection.
Wonderful. So I hope that answers your question.
That helps. We have a kind of a challenge in our storage area. We have like those kind of metal baker rack type storage things, but we did get some flat boxes, and I do have some tubes as well.
Awesome.
And they are the archival tubes, so we can wrap some. Mostly I'm just worried about storing the ones with the mold with the ones without mold, but
keep those separate,
all kind
definitely.
of together. So it's such a huge collection too. So it's just going to be a challenge to store them, but
yeah, definitely keep molded
help.
things separate until you've cleaned them.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That helps a lot.
No more answers in the chat, but who would like to speak up and ask a question? Okay, then I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say, Bexx, why don't you introduce us now to your quirky tool, and then at the end we will reveal what they really are.
Ooh, okay. I brought a couple things, but I'll show this one off first. So it's got a wood handle with a metal ferrule, and this is stone, actually, agate. And so it looks kind of like that on that end.
Cool. Your other one.
Other thing I have is something that we use probably every single day. So I won't give any hints because then I'll give it away. But
right. Hey Barrett, what have you got for us?
I've got this little tube made of wood, Turkish boxwood. And look, there's a smaller version of it. And they make a noise.
Uh-huh.
Big one, little one.
Do they fit inside each other?
I knew you were going to ask that. No, they're not nesting dolls.
Okay, I'm stumped. Okay, I brought this as an illustration of what a recent colleague was calling blunt ratcheting scissors. They're not blunt ratcheting scissors, but I'll show you why she called it that, because here's a little grabber. And as you can see, there is no point. So I want to know if anybody can come up with the right name for that. Then the other thing I brought is this. It looks like a pretty average ruler-ish kind of thing, but it's not average. It does this. So being a textile conservator, sometimes we use these, and I invite people, whether you sew or not, to later to identify why we would want something that did this. So those are my gadgets.
Nice.
So, I'm seeing answers that from my know-it-all friends in the queries.
Yeah.
Ding ding. So good job.
Maracas.
So funny. So Camille, I used one of those. I used to be a fly fisherman, and I used the. Well,
Yeah.
The answer was correct. I don't know about the spelling, but hemostat, right? For actually holding the flies and doing the hook and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
How do you use it?
Clamp or hemostat. Now, when you watch a medical television show, you'll hear those two words a lot. They'll yell for clamp or hemostat, and I'm always like, I've got one.
You got to slap it into the palm, though, right?
Yeah.
And, also, it's a really interesting reminder that conservators don't always get our tools from conservation vendors. That I used to pick these up along with scissors and tweezers at like the Monday market in England, where my husband lived, because Pakistani steel is very commonly used, and they're made in Pakistan. So there's a lot of Pakistani vendors there. But I'm sure there are I've seen these at flea markets. There's a flea market in New Hampshire that has all this medical stuff too. So as long as you don't think there's something creepy about the place that's selling them, you can look anywhere for this stuff, and you don't have to pay a premium. Not that we don't want you to support our vendors and the people that spend their careers sourcing very important materials for us. That's great too. We have a guess. We have a guess that I know is right, and then a guess that I'm mysterious about. So Karen Feeney, do you want to tell us what you think Bexx's second object is?
I think they're soot sponges. They're used to clean lots of different things, but used for like when I use them actually sometimes for cleaning scrapbook covers a lot, but they could be used for getting they kind of absorb soot or dirt from objects. I think that's what they are, and you can cut them different sizes and everything. But that's a longer, flatter one than I've ever seen. I usually see them; they look like a little brick size, but yeah, I don't know. That's what I think it is.
Bexx probably does the same thing we do, which is there's usually seam down the middle, and I split them in two because I'm cheap. But
Yeah.
Bexx, what else do you use them for?
Yep, for cleaning books and paper, for covers and for pages. They're great because you use it dry, of course, even though it's a sponge, because they don't leave behind a residue, which is really fantastic, and they're pretty minimally abrasive. It's true, soot sponges. So I have forgotten to open the flue in my fireplace and had to use it to clean my wall.
Oh.
And that's actually what they're designed for.
Doesn't matter if you see them in red, blue, yellow. Some brands will say this is for cat hair, this is for dog hair. That's all BS. They're just trying to market their materials. A study was done of different brands in different colors and found that the active ingredient is still vulcanized rubber. And although we prefer the neutral ones, don't panic if what you see are pink ones for poodles. It's still vulcanized rubber, and you can use it. Barrett, what are your objects? There's a couple guesses.
Okay, well, this is a Turkish boxwood little container that has turned threads. And usually we put very small drill bits, but this time we have some 18th or 19th century nails and some hand cut screws. And so if we're taking apart a job at a house and we have any hardware that comes off of the job, and we need something to put them in when they're really small, like this little guy, tiny handmade nail that somebody may have banged in to keep something on. We want to keep all of the original materials, all the original fasteners, and sometimes it's a lot easier to put it into this than little tiny Ziploc baggies, which you then have to mark with your Sharpie and make sure it's the right job. So, and the smaller one, same thing, but little brads that get really tiny and even smaller, and it's just a nice way to store them. And instead of, I have a drawer that's over 35 years has literally thousands of Ziploc baggies and spare fasteners in them. But these are kind of neat. They stand out.
They're very snazzy. I forgot, Bex, what was your other object? Oh, right. The thing with agate on it. Wow.
The burnisher.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So no one had any other guesses?
Yes, a burnisher, an agate burnisher for gilding.
Correct. So for any kind of edge decoration, whether you're doing like gold or silver or, red or yellow is really common. You would put some beeswax on top of that or microcrystalline wax and then use that to burnish it and polish it. But it's also used like when you make marbled paper that has to be sealed and polished with beeswax or something like that, or microcrystalline wax.
Nice.
And when we do labels for boxes, we do also seal those. Although we don't necessarily use the agate burnisher, but yeah.
Nice.
So the next time I'm making marble paper this weekend, for example, I forget. Yeah, we all do that, right?
Yes.
And the gilding. I think I'm gilding on Sunday, so that's a good thing to know. I'm kidding.
What happened to the fly fishing? What happened to the fly fishing dam?
Yeah, right.
That's a really snazzy tool. That reminds me of the kind of thing where maybe in the first few years of private practice, I'll be using like some like broken piece of agate I got at a store, like with my fingers. And then like eventually I get to buy the big girl tool and get like the one with the handle on it. So.
They can get pricey and they make bigger ones. They make ones that are like a houndstooth shape. And they also make them out of hematite is another thing that you see. So they're nice. If you find one, if you see one for sale at a flea market, buy it because they're a nice thing.
Oh. Josh asked where you can buy one of these bendy rulers, and I believe I just looked it up to make sure that I had the French name of it right, which I didn't see, but it popped up on Joann's or through Amazon, other vendors like that. This one does not have a brand on it. So the question is, why would I want to A, measure and B, bend something? And I think most of you can imagine that garments are super three-dimensional. And so the reason why you might want a bendy ruler is so that you can get a dimension estimate from something without having to pull it into a straight line. So that's very advantageous for things that are delicate that you might not want to handle. But you could use it to measure like around a pot or something like that. So in that way, it's kind of the same as a measuring tape. But the other reason I use this is, for example, when I'm building a support or a mount for an artifact, I might need to make it symmetrical. And so what I like about this is I can form this around like the thing I make for the left arm, and then I can mimic the form with this ruler, flip it, trace it onto paper, or I can use it to compare the left and right of something. And so it's reminiscent of an old tool, French tool called a sartoche, which is what my grad school teacher called it. But when I just Googled it now, they're just flexible rulers. But have you ever used one of these, Bexx or Barrett?
Yes, I use one. I love them.
I have not. And when you brought that out and showed it, I was like, I need to go buy 10. So
they're awesome.
Yeah, they're pretty good. They have a good habit of not being in my toolkit when I really need it, though. So, okay. Let's see who's next with questions.
Looks like somebody asked about any dehumidifier recommendations.
Yes, I have that. So, dehumidifier recommendations. Are we on?
Yeah.
So we have one in the shop that is a commercial dehumidifier after years and years and years of using the small $300 and $400 dehumidifiers that would break 3 and 4 years later and throwing them away at the dump. We finally got a commercial unit. It's called a Santa Fe. It's about 4 feet high. It can take down an 1,800 square foot space from 80% relative humidity down to 40 in about 2.5 hours. Not that you'd want to take something down a space that quickly, but it, in some of these like flood situations, like Dan was talking about, or Bexx was talking about, you may want to really reduce the moisture content quickly. I think they're made by Thermador is the company. But they are the real deal. They it's about $1,500. I think they used to be around $1,200. There's a lot of support for them, I know, on the East Coast and in the Midwest, and they work flawlessly. And I've piped mine to the outside. It's got a long drain, so I don't have to take any pans and empty them. But they have filters on top, which can be replaced very easily, and a humidistat that you turn when you turn it on, so you can actually set when it comes on and off according to the relative humidity in the room. And once we got it 10 years ago, we maybe use it 3 times a year. It's that powerful in the spring and in the fall, and the rest of the year we use air conditioning. But it's there if you need it to dry a space down very quickly and efficiently.
Yeah. Is it near where you're sitting?
Yeah, I'll bring well, the camera's attached by USB, otherwise I'd show it to you, but I will I'll send a link afterwards. I can't do it now, to Thermador, and actually I recommend them to all my clients. It's amazing how many clients they make. Mine is a vertical unit that's 4 feet high by about 2 feet by 2 feet. But you can also get that same unit in a horizontal unit if you want to put it in a crawl space or an attic, or any place where the vertical units won't work. So they're just heads and tails above anything I've ever used. They're the real deal.
I wrote all of that down. Thank you so much. That's
Oh, you're welcome. I just love it saves so many tens of thousands of dollars in mold damage. You know, I tell people, even if you put it in the lower section of your buildings, it's going to prevent all the floors and all the carpets and everything above it from growing mold. It's the best thing you can do. The only caveat I have to give is I tell people, don't try to make your space too dry, because the law of nature tries to always balance things. So if you're sucking all the air and moisture out of that, all of the moisture out of the air in your basement facility, it's going to try to balance with moisture from the outside. So if you try to get it down into the 40s, which you can with these units, you can get your relative humidity down into the 40s. You're basically going to be sucking lots of moisture through the concrete brick or foundation into that space to try to equalize the humidity. So I always tell people 55, 60 is it. You know, there's no need to go lower than that.
Yeah.
That's a very dry environment in the summertime.
It looks like Dan had a question about a grant for a dehumidifier, and then I know Angela had a question as well.
Grants, boy, Dan, I rely on NEMA and other professional organizations to help with grants. Because I am a for-profit, as most private conservators are, although I believe NADCC is a nonprofit organization. So I don't get grants, my clients get grants. So I'm not the best person to answer this. Perhaps Bexx can suggest a few places to go for support like this.
Definitely. So first, I just want to share a quick link in the chat that's a EPA guide to dehumidifier basics. And that basically just helps you figure out what size dehumidifier you need based on your space, like how damp it is in your space, how big your space is, and then how powerful of a dehumidifier you need when you're picking one out. Just helpful. Because like you said, you don't want to make it too dry. In terms of grants for dehumidifiers, I think some things that could pay for something like that are NEH's Preservation Assistance Grant. But the caveat there is that that is only going to pay for supplies and equipment if you have already had a preservation assessment done and that you've gotten a recommendation from a conservator or a preservation professional that that's something that you need to purchase. Another good thing might be NEH's Sustaining Cultural Heritage, and they have both a planning and an implementation grant, and those are for bigger projects, so it wouldn't just be for small dehumidifiers, but like if you're doing a larger environmental project, whether that's environmental monitoring or upgrading your existing HVAC system, and that might be, if you have the ability to incorporate both humidification and dehumidification into your HVAC instead of having standalone units, that's also a really great thing. But that's, like I said, that's a bigger project. And those are the two that I'm thinking of off the top of my head that are probably the most likely sources.
You mentioned too, so you mentioned getting a preservation assessment, CAP grants. Those are still available through AIC. Is that, no, what is it? Who does the CAP grants? But anyway, I know that that's something when I was museum director, and it's like, wow, this is unbelievable as sort of a first step towards other great things in the conservation realm. Can somebody speak to that?
Camille, are you a CAP assessor by chance?
I considered it earlier in my career, but I don't have a particularly broad range of knowledge. I'm a little bit narrow. So I never completed that process, but I've done a bunch of full facility surveys. I want you to, if you're researching this, folks, I want you to, don't be surprised if CAP is no longer the name. There's been a few changes in names over the last, say, 5-10 years. I believe these are NEH supported. Yes, I see an NEH in both of your links, but there's been just a little bit of wiggling around of these things. I think that's really all I recall about.
Sure.
About that, yeah.
So it is an NEH grant, but it's administered through AIC. And so you have members of AIC can apply to be CAP assessors as well as other preservation professionals. So I am a CAP assessor, but I have never been called to do a CAP assessment. So I know a little, but yeah, so that can be a great holistic kind of building and collection survey process. And that's one grant program that can help fund that. NEH's Preservation Assistance Grant is another grant that can fund assessments, as is the MAP, the Museum Assessment, which is an IMLS grant. And so if you are a museum or historic house, they encourage you to apply for the MAP or the CAP, and the PAG, the Preservation Assistance, is more geared to libraries and archives.
Wonderful, wonderful. Before we leave the topic of dehumidifiers, I want to sort of mention a few things that I've seen go wrong when I work with clients that use them. The biggest mistake we make is that we have an underpowered unit that will fill its tray or its bucket in a matter of a couple of hours, and then it shuts off. And if, say, you don't come for a week or two, the water in the bucket will tend to mold. Also, even if it hasn't, just carrying that amount of water through your collections is just fraught with problems. So Barrett said the magic word, which is hose or tube. If you can get to a floor drain or over into a bathtub or something. I remember one place we actually, there was a washer and dryer. So we opened the washer, we sat the dehumidifier on the dryer, we had a hose that went into the washer. And so then we had the whole capacity of that washing machine to collect our water. And then they would go where at intervals, they would just shut the washer and they would run it to drain it. And then every once in a while, they'd run soap through it. So that's like the kind of solutions that small institutions use all the time. Just be very careful. Anytime you sequester or you scavenge something out of your environment, you create a reservoir, whether that is a pollutant or a mineral, or in this case, water. You create a reservoir of whatever you're trying to pull away. And sometimes it's dealing with that reservoir that you've evacuated that is the biggest challenge. So I try not to rely on just a little unit. A window unit for an air conditioner is sometimes the better investment for a small historic house, because you can, again, set your temperature, and with a little research and a little, sort of trust and faith, you can get to a reasonable temperature to set it at like 74. That's not going to use too much electricity, and it's going to reduce the humidity in the space by sort of a non-scientific amount, but it's still better than doing nothing. And you can get them for $199. You don't have to empty the water. So think about air conditioning as a way to address dehumidification as well.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. Especially another problem that I see with smaller dehumidifiers is that maybe you have your collection storage vault is a pretty small enclosed space, and those dehumidifiers throw off heat when they're running. And so then they raise the temperature. So then you crank up your AC, which is a cool air, it uses moist air to cool. So it raises the humidity. So you turn up the dehumidifier and it makes it warm. And you end up canceling out the effects and wasting a lot of energy in the process. And so, yeah, lowering the temperature of your air conditioning and getting a window unit can be really useful to bringing down the humidity, and you don't sort of have that escalating competing equipment.
Right.
Great point, Bexx.
I know we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to get to Angela's question of if asking for a friend if a sheet used to cover furniture was washed in hot wash with a bit of OxyClean extra rinse, and it later turned out to be a collection item. What's the next step to take?
You can only imagine how many historic sheets we have in our cabinet that people bring stuff in and then forget. I'll say, do you want it back? And they're like, no. So the answer is that artifact might age differently over the next 100 years than its mate that was not OxyCleaned or not exposed to UV light or other things that happened. So long term, they have different survival expectations, but it isn't a super crisis thing. OxyClean, it removes soil through oxidation, and the process of oxidation and reduction is kind of like drying and wetting. It's something that achieves balance and requires things out in the environment in order to sort of go in one direction or another. So we find that OxyCleaned garments and things like that will just re-yellow over time. It's just that you're sort of doing an extreme form of cleaning up front, which of course has a lot of risks. In terms of just a white cotton or linen sheet, Angela, you might opt not to put that one on display because it is slightly more susceptible to these aging properties. Hopefully you have another one, but also it's probably not representative of the color of that sheet when it was in use historically. So it may have sort of been taken, made a little bit less useful from a collections perspective for that reason. But I know you'll find just the right circumstance for it, just the right place, like maybe a dark space where you can keep your lighting low if you're using a slightly brighter sheet, something like that. Not the end of the world. Okay, who else among our esteemed attendees has a question for Bexx about book and paper? It's such a rare opportunity for me to learn all of this stuff about this medium that is so close to textiles, organic, plant-based. So anybody else want to speak up?
I think Gregory had a show and tell.
Yes, I do. This may surprise most of you, but Barrett, I don't think it'll surprise you. Let me see if I can get it to where I can show it to you.
Oh, look at that. That's the biggest cuckoo clock I've ever seen.
It's the largest I've ever owned.
To
My question is the very bottom. The whole case is veneered in mahogany, and the bottom is peeling off. I can see the hide glue from where it has fallen off, and I'm just curious to know what I can do about doing that in following the rules of conservation, which Barrett has been very generous with his information on. And by the way, Barrett, it's 25 years this month that you walked into my shop. I've known you for that long. But you've been very generous with the information you've given me along the way.
Greg is a longtime friend, a clock conservator here on Cape Cod, who used to do all clocks and now has wisely decided to specialize in only cuckoo clocks or Black Forest clocks.
Not really. I do everything now.
Oh, okay. Well, now you just opened Pandora's box.
Well, you might recall the clock we worked on that went through the fire and sat in a damp, unheated house for 6 months.
Yes, yes. So that clock, Greg, that you have there is amazing. I'd love to see that in person, and I'll be glad to give you some thoughts on the different types of hide glue that I would use to consolidate your lifting veneers. The great thing about hide glue or animal glue is that you can always just add new hide glue onto the old existing hide glue, and it will melt right into it, and you don't have to remove it or do anything that might harm the finish on the veneers. So yeah, either, in our shop we use hot hide glue that's always in a pot that's heated at 150 degrees all day long.
I've seen that, yeah.
You can vary the viscosity of it depending on the job, how viscous or non-viscous you want it to be. And if the open time there's many different gram strengths hide glue that determine the open time. I usually work with a high gram strength hide glue that has an open time of about 20 seconds because I want things to tack up that quickly. But if you have a lot of veneer and it's a large piece, you can get a lower gram strength, something like 196, that will give you an open time of maybe a minute and a half. And if you need more than that, you can buy a pre-prepared hide glue that will give you an open time. It has additives and extenders in it that allow it to stay open for about an hour, which is nice if you need time to clamp and make sure it's in the right place or do cleanup. It gives somebody who doesn't use hide glue a lot, or somebody who has a large project, a lot more open time, which gives you a lot more comfort. So I'll be glad to share that all with you, Greg, afterwards, when I see pictures of the piece or how big the area is, but that would be the general way to do it. Yes.
I'll send you some photos. I'm more curious about what I can use to replace the missing pieces. There's not much of it that's gone, but I wondered if I would be able to fill it with something and color it to match.
You can. If you're going to do that, you want to make sure it's reversible. So usually we'll put a barrier coat in there, something like hide glue, a couple coats of hide glue. That in the future, if you want to put a filler in there, you could always go in with hot water and reverse hide glue because it is reversible.
Right.
So, and then what filler you use depends on what you're used to and what you like and what you find to be user friendly. But again, I'll be glad to make some suggestions to you after the Zoom meeting on what I'd recommend you use for a filler. And you want something that's easily carvable, I assume. Is it a carved area?
No, it's just a flat bottom of the clock.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The carvings are great. A friend of mine who's unfortunately no longer with us did make a couple of pieces, like one of the deer's ears. I guess his ears were missing. One of the ears was missing, and he carved it, and he did a beautiful job.
Nice.
I need to get a pair of antlers made for it. The antlers, I have the base, so I know pretty much what it should look like.
Yeah.
This clock will be about 50 inches tall once.
Wow.
With the addition of the antlers. The movement is a 3-train. I don't know if you're familiar with cuckoo clocks, but this is a quail. And cuckoo, the quail comes out on the quarter hours, and then the cuckoo sounds the hours. And it's also known as a fusee key wind movement. Very complicated and scary to work on. The main springs are about 3 inches wide, 50 inches long. And I break a sweat when I work with them. But this has been a long-term project. I've had this clock for about 10 years.
Wow.
And I work on it for a little while, and then I just put it aside.
I like that. I like that. Greg, does that clock sit on its base, or does it hang on the wall?
It's a wall hanging clock.
Wow.
Yeah.
How much do you think it weighs?
As it sits there now, probably about 40 pounds, but the movement is probably another 15 or 20.
Wow.
It has a very strong back to it that's secured, and it just hangs like any other cuckoo clock would. But I'm considering having someone make a base for it so it doesn't, the entire weight of the clock's not hanging off the back. I would hate to have that tumble off the wall at some point.
Sure. Wow, that's a one-of-a-kind piece. I look forward to seeing that.
Oh, it's such a unique piece, and thanks for showing us, Greg. And thank you so much, Bexx and Camille and Barrett. We are at 1 o'clock. I think Camille, you've put everybody's emails in the chat, and I'm going to drop a link to some of our upcoming events. If anybody ever has any questions, you can always email us at nima@nimanet.org. Otherwise, have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks, Camille. Thanks, Barrett. And thanks, Bexx.
Thank you, Scarlett.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.